Welcome to Acton Line, the podcast of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Eric Cohn, executive producer. Common grace is both a theological doctrine within the Reformed tradition and the title of a truly monumental book discussing the doctrine by the theologian and statesman Abraham Kuyper. It is grace from God that is common to all of mankind, distinct from both the special grace by which God redeems, sanctifies, and glorifies his people, as well as the gift of creation itself. Kuyper puts it this way: common grace issues from God, and from God come all the means that we humans must apply to oppose sin and its consequences in curse and misery. But it is God himself who leads us to find the means and instructs us how to use them. And it is precisely the latter that is forgotten. The human inventor of the electric light and electric motor is extolled, but God, who led Edison to discover it, is passed over. Today, Acton's Dan Huger talks with Jordan Ballor, Senior Research Fellow and Director of Publishing at the Acton Institute, and General Editor of the 12-volume Abraham Kuyper, Collected Works in Public Theology, about Kuyper's exploration of the doctrine in his monumental work, Common Grace. The third and final volume of this work, jointly published by Lexham Press and the Acton Institute, has recently been published in English translation. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line on our website at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen.
Today I am joined by Jordan Ballor, Senior Research Fellow and Director of Publishing at the Acton Institute. He is also a postdoctoral researcher in theology and economics at the Free University in Amsterdam as part of the What Good Markets Are Good For project. He is also General Editor of the 12-volume Abraham Kuyper, Collected Works in Public Theology. Jordan, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be here.
Now, what is the doctrine of common grace, and what relation does it have to Kuyper's 3-volume work of the same name?
So the doctrine of common grace is essentially the idea, the teaching that in addition to special saving grace that God offers us through the gospel, there is another kind of grace that follows the fall into sin and allows the world to continue in some way. So common grace on this understanding is different from special grace in that it applies to everyone, everywhere, always, actually everything, if you understand it in its most comprehensive sense. It's not just about all people. It's about the entirety of the created order. So it differs from special grace in that sense that it's not reserved just for the elect or the members of the church or something like that. So it's common in that sense, and it's grace because it's a gift from God. It's a good gift from God that comes to us. And the context of it is, certainly for Abraham Kuyper, a post-fall reality. So that's an important thing to note about common grace for Kuyper is that it's there's a sense in which you could talk about creation itself as a kind of a grace, and obviously that would be universal because everything that's created has been created. But for Kuyper especially, he wouldn't call that common grace, at least in the same sense. This common grace has a historical context to it. It's a divine response to something that's happened, and that's the fall into sin.
And that context is what Kuyper sort of unravels in these volumes, and he kind of goes through the biblical narrative. Could you talk a little bit about the structure of the book and how that plays with his argument?
Yeah, so Abraham Kuyper, this late 19th, early 20th century Dutch Reformed theologian, is many things in addition to being a theologian. One of them is a journalist. And so one of his standard modes of operation was to write periodic editorials for one of the, for his newspapers and then collect those into a book. So he's a kind of an entrepreneur too. So he'd sell you the thing in newspaper form and then sell it to you again in a book and, if there were social media, he'd sell it to you again, those days as in his Twitter feed or something like that. So,
he would have a podcast.
No doubt about it. So Common Grace originated as installments in his weekly Reformed newspaper, the Herald, De Heraut. And then he collected these together, and they were published in the early part of the 20th century, in the first decade of the 20th century, in these 3 volumes, and they're massive. So there's 3 volumes. The first volume is focused on a kind of biblical exposition and a biblical grounding of the doctrine, and we can say more about that in a minute. The second volume is focused on a kind of systematic theological exposition of the doctrine, and the third volume is more the kind of concrete practical application, where the implications for this doctrine for our understanding of social life most broadly. So that's the structure of his argument. These are in the context of the 12-volume series of Abraham Kuyper that we've done. These are the 3 largest volumes on their own. The second volume of the 3 is the largest of the 3. So it's something like 2,000 pages between the 3 volumes, something like so in translation. So these are truly massive works, and yet they're accessible and significant. And there's a reason he spent so much time on this topic.
Yeah. Now what's the problem that Kuyper sees in Reformed theology that he's trying to solve through expositing this doctrine?
So Kuyper's explanation of what's going on with why this doctrine needs 2,000 pages, part of it is he sees a lacuna in the Reformed tradition. So there's something missing. Now, he's very careful to ground the doctrine itself in the Reformed tradition. So he doesn't want to say, here's some new thing the Reformed tradition has never had that I'm bringing to it. So in that sense, he doesn't want to claim to be a radical innovator. Instead, his argument goes something like this. Here's a doctrine that was affirmed right away in the Reformation, including by figures like John Calvin. Here's a doctrine that got confessional articulation and was formerly a part of the Reformed tradition in something like the Canons of Dort in the early part of the 17th century. And yet, in the successive generations and centuries now of theologians, no one has spent very much time talking about it. They may say it exists. They may, in the systematic theologies, they may give a set of distinctions for grace and say there's a special grace and a general grace and then blah, blah, but move on and only want to talk about special grace or something like that. So it's there in the Reformed tradition, but it's been missing in the sense of getting the attention it deserves. And it's especially salient for Kuyper for a lot of reasons, but one of the key ones is that he's living in an important period of transition, now 400 years on from the Reformation, where technological advance is happening, early forms of globalization are happening, the society is diversifying. There's more plurality in the world that you're encountering through media and various kinds, but also at home for him in the Netherlands. So it functions as a kind of doctrine to explain on the basis on which we should live in common with non-Christians is one way to think about it. What's going on in the world that God, it's his world, all of it's his world. Kuyper's famous for these kinds of cosmic and comprehensive claims about the lordship of Christ. So what is God doing outside of the realm of the elect, we could say, from a very Calvinistic perspective? What is God doing outside of the realm, say, of the institutional church or the holy, as we would traditionally think about it? Is he acting in the world, or is it all just as bad as it could possibly be? What's going on? And that's where the doctrine of common grace fits in part for Kuyper.
Yeah, so there's this world context, and Kuyper's very much part of this as a statesman. Another volume in this series is on Islam, where he gives his reflections and engagement with Islam and some of the actually broader Christian world, even outside the Islamic world, or the broader non-Christian world outside of the Islamic world. And then in the Netherlands also, there are, of course, Roman Catholics, and there are are secular liberals, there are socialists, and these people are all also active in the political arena that Kuyper's active in as well. And can this be thought of as a way to try to this is a way to try to theologically ground how those interactions happen? Yeah,
I think that's right. So one of the ways Kuyper will explain what common grace is as an explanatory doctrine, or it has an explanatory function. So we encounter this phenomenon in our own experience where what we confess about the Spirit's role in regeneration and the call to holiness that God communicates to His church, and yet we encounter disappointing realities, let's put it that way, to put it mildly, in those contexts. So there's a sense in which the church, in our experience, doesn't measure up to what we confess it ought to be. And then on the other hand, we say these things about the pagans and the heathens and the socialists and the left, or whatever you want to say out there, the world. We confess certain things about them. They're unregenerate. They can do no good, right? These sorts of things will be articulated. And yet our experience is not everything is horrible. Things aren't as bad as they seem like they should be, right? So there's some good in the world. So this is partly what's going on here. Is Kuyper, on the one hand, doctrinally wants to explain, there's this connection between nature, created nature, and fallen human nature and saving grace, such that sanctification is an ongoing process, and the old Adam is not completely conquered until the eschaton and things like that. So that explains in part why things aren't as good in the church as they should be. And then on the other hand, the doctrine of common grace helps explain too why there's any good in the world that we clearly perceive. I mean, there's maybe not good in some absolute sense, but if you make distinctions about types of good, and there's very clearly good in some sense. So how do we explain that theologically? That's part of what's going on.
Yeah. There are moral exemplars in the world outside of the church. There are great works of art.
Yeah, there's genius, objective genius. So, certainly within a limited sense, you could talk about civic morality. You could talk about pagan virtues and things like that. But it's even not really primarily about morality. It is to some extent for Kuyper, but it's not just, say, reducible to a moral understanding of the natural law. So I would say, for example, a doctrine of natural law in the Reformed tradition, a traditional understanding of it would be in manifestation of common grace.
A particular
the work
instance
of God to restrain through conscience the behavior of the unregenerate is an expression of common grace. It's not identical, say, to natural law. So natural law would be a form that common grace comes to the world. Yeah.
And now there's controversy associated with this idea in the Reformed tradition. What's the nature of that controversy? I mean, this doctrine has a great deal of explanatory power about our personal experience. Kuyper is very careful in biblically grounding this in the first volume, but there was still a lot of pushback at the time, and remains in some Reformed circles today to this notion.
Yeah, it's been a controversial doctrine for sure. There's no doubt about it. Part of it has to do, I think, with the thing that we were just talking about, which is that it provides a kind of lens or a framework for engaging positively and even constructively with people outside of the covenant community, which to certain kinds of Christian communities is antithetical to their whole self-understanding, that we need to separate ourselves from the world, and all this. So there's that element of it that this doctrine is a danger to. So one very sharp criticism that comes is that this doesn't, Christianize the world. This doctrine, makes the church worldly. It makes the church prone to cultural accommodation and to basically not live up to its calling as a special community, as a gathered community. So part of it's that there's this sense of purity or isolation or one of Kuyper's big targets is Anabaptists, at least in a kind of caricatured sense, but even, that they're just happy having a book in a nook and being left to themselves, and they don't want to be associated with the world. And Kuyper's response to that is, no, God calls us to be agents of his disciples in the world. So it's not a matter of being faithful by withdrawing. And common grace is one of these things that helps us understand how we can live in the context of the world and yet not ideally be accommodated to it. Obviously, there's going to be temptations and so on. That other danger, though, the one with danger is isolation, withdrawal. The other danger is accommodation. And Kuyper is very sensitive to that even from the beginning. So you'll find very clear expositions that this doctrine, it's an abuse of this doctrine to de-emphasize, the rough edges of the gospel or something like that. It's an abuse of this doctrine to engage in licentiousness and worldly behavior because, it's common grace or something like that. So I don't mean to say that criticisms of this doctrine are all necessarily misguided or malintentioned or anything like that. No, there are very legitimate ways in which this doctrine can and has historically been abused and misused. At the same time, it doesn't mean that there's no truth to the reality of common grace in the world. So it's an argument certainly against abuse, and it's an argument for proper understanding and, in that sense, proper use of the doctrine and warning against its abuse.
Before we get back to this episode of Acton Line, I want to take a moment to tell you about our newest podcast, Acton Institute Events. The Acton Institute's international events include public lectures, academic seminars, joint participation in panels, the annual Acton University Conference, the Institute's annual dinner, and more, all focused on illustrating our vision of a free and virtuous society characterized by individual liberty and sustained by religious principles. Previous event speakers have included Acton's own Reverend Robert Sirico, Samuel Gregg, and Michael Matheson Miller. Other speakers have included P.J. O'Rourke, Yuval Levin, Anthony Bradley, Arthur Brooks, Jonah Goldberg, Stephanie Slade, Bradley Berzer, Ann Rathbone Bradley, and many others. To subscribe to the Acton Institute Events podcast, look for a link in the show notes for this episode of Acton Line, or just search Acton Institute Events on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are found. Now, back to the show.
We've talked about some of these distinctions earlier, the distinctions between the creation itself, between common grace and between special grace. And Kuyper is very careful to distinguish these. And that's part of that understanding. Now, how does Kuyper's understanding of common grace fit into his broader conception as a theologian, and particularly as a sort of public theologian?
So I think common grace helps Kuyper ground his public activity and his public discipleship, you could say. And public theology wasn't, say, a discipline at that time, but I mean he's an exemplar of what public theology is, certainly from the Reformed tradition's case. So it can help him make distinctions about the kinds of political and public activity that he thinks he should be engaging in, and make the kinds of distinctions that he thinks need to be made to do that faithfully. So, for example, he'll make the point that on certain questions of, say, social ethics or public policy even, that the view of the human person that's confessed by the Reformed and the Roman Catholics is not a key point of departure, that there's basic agreement there, and that we should be co-belligerents, and there should be a kind of practical ecumenical alliance between these two in the public square for this reason. Maybe it's school choice, or maybe it has to do with ethical issues in terms of public policy or something like that. That instead of thinking very narrowly and tribally about the Reformed, there's good in the world that we can work with others to help be good stewards of and to protect and to promote. So that's part of what's going on with Kuyper and Common Grace. Is it's a groundwork for public engagement and collaboration. It's funny in Common Grace, So even though there's this positive kind of ecumenical, I think of ecumenical as positive generally. I know many people listening to this podcast maybe don't, but again, it's an abuse of ecumenical when it's not a good thing. So for Kuyper, on the one hand, he'll speak very positively about the prospects for, say, working with Roman Catholics to solve the problem of poverty and fight socialism and materialism and atomistic individualism and things like this. But even in the context there, then he'll turn around and in the next section he's going to talk about nature and grace and say, oh, well, Bellarmine's horrible, you know, and be very strongly so in that sense, it's not about softening the rough edges of distinctive, teachings of the Reformed faith. It's about properly contextualizing those and say, well, here's where we agree, here's where we disagree. These disagreements are really, really important in this area. These disagreements are actually not that important. These agreements are really important in this area, but they don't mean that the disagreements that we have in this other area aren't salient either. So part of it's a discernment kind of an exercise for Kuyper. So that's part of what's going on.
Yeah. And when you talk about these different areas, this is one of the other things that Kuyper is very known for is this notion of sphere sovereignty. How do those two things relate, this doctrine of common grace and the sphere sovereignty? Because particularly in the application, I think there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah. So, okay, sphere sovereignty is Kuyper's understanding that God in creation now, so not as a post-fall reality, but in creation has decided to create in such a way that there's all kinds of diversity inherent in the created order, including but not limited to the human race, and that within the context of humanity, there are all kinds of different gifts and orientations and dispositions and callings, you could say, that are given to people, just as qua people, qua humans. Mm-hmm. So these come to expression in all kinds of different relationships and formalized relationships, institutions you could call them, associations, whatever. And each one of these is got its marching orders in a way, and its validation directly from God, its authorization directly from God, because He created it to be that way. So you can think about marriage in this sense. Marriage is its own institution. It's not just a human construct, even if there are elements of positive law and custom that go along with it. It's not reducible to those things. God has willed marriage as a product of His created order. So it's a sovereign sphere for Kuyper because it's got a delimitation in terms of what it covers, but it's got a law that governs its life that's given directly by the lawgiver, you could say, by the sovereign. Mm-hmm. Now, that works itself out in the context of secondary causes like fathers and mothers and siblings and grandparents and all the complex relationships that actually form, say, a family. But for Kuyper, it's very clear that those all that diversity of relationships and dynamics are embedded in the created order, and they come to manifestation as people live in history. So that's just a given of creation for Kuyper, and it's very important for him. And in fact, the distinction between male and female right at the beginning for him is a kind of in nuce, endorsement of all the kinds of good diversity all the multiformity that you'll see later throughout human history. Now, common grace in the context of sin allows that to continue to exist. So there's a few things that common grace actually does. One thing is, you could understand where you've got this radical fall into sin from humanity. That's the representative not just of all the humans that are going to come later, but in a sense the cosmos. There's this microcosmic dimension to humanity. And God could have said justly, this stuff I'm going to throw into the dustbin, basically, right? Common grace is God saying, no, I'm going to allow things to continue to exist in the face of this radical fall. So that's one thing that common grace does, is allow anything to exist at all anymore once we've got sin. The second thing it does is keep things from being as bad as they would otherwise be. So you could imagine God say, yeah, I'll give you existence, which is good, but I'm not going to check the effects of sin in any way. And the closest we get to that, at least in the biblical narrative that Kuyper understands, is the times right before the flood.
Yeah.
That's And in fact, the Noahic covenant is for Kuyper the paradigmatic covenant of common grace. So that's where he starts his Bible. It doesn't start it with Adam. Mm-hmm. He starts with Noah and works kind of backwards to Adam, to a more created anthropology. But so that's the other thing it does, is it stops things from being as horrible as they might otherwise have been. And then on the other side, it allows actual good to continue and be produced, even outside of Christian circles. And this is where sphere sovereignty still is. So there are sovereign spheres even among the non-Christians because they're embedded in creation and they're expressions of humanity as humanity, not as regenerated humanity. So the state would be an excellent example of a sphere that exists, the Lutheran confession and the Reformed confession, that government exists also among the pagan. Well, that's an expression of common grace, that there's some kind of political order that exists even among non-Christians. And so that's sort of how one way in which those two relate is common grace allows sphere sovereignty in the context of all of existence to continue to exist and to continue to provide some guidance and positive framework for cultural development.
That Noah point is key. So I want to circle back to this, because what happens is there is evil unbound throughout the earth. God brings the flood. And the covenant with Noah is that he will never again destroy all the earth.
Yeah.
And
with water, at least.
Yeah, with water.
The meteors, the sweet meteor of death is still coming? I don't know.
Yeah. But there's a way in which also that's a reestablishment not only of the preservation of existence, of the survival of the human race as individual persons, but the survival of family, the survival of nations, the survival of all of these orders that Kuyper thinks are sort of embedded in what it is to be a person.
Right. And the survival of morality too, right? So you've got the Noahide commandments. Mm-hmm. That's part of the covenant. So people will talk the covenantal distinctions are really interesting, and there's an important history there. But they'll talk about the covenant with Noah or the Noahic covenant as a general covenant because it applies to everything, and an unconditional covenant because it's not as if there's anything that you can expect animals to do to uphold the covenant of this general covenant. There's no conditions to it. So. And yes, all of these things are preserved. All of these created intentions, all of these created possibilities that God embedded in the original creation are in a sense preserved on that ark and communicated to Noah's posterity historically afterwards. So the different institutions, all of this kind of created diversity that hasn't come to expression yet, all of these discoveries that humans are going to make about the world and the way that things works, all of these inventions that are going to come about, all of the art that's going to be produced, they're all still there in some sense federally or seminally or whatever representatively present on the ark. And so that's why for Kuyper this is a paradigmatic common grace covenant, because it's preserving all of these things that otherwise would have been lost in the fall.
Mm-hmm. Kuyper got me to read those sections after about the genealogies that we often eyes glaze over. But embedded in those genealogies after that are the rise of so many things, music, metallurgy, all of these sorts of things that we think part and parcel of civilization and culture that emerged directly out of the ark and its descendants.
Right. So let me say one of the most significant parts of the Common Grace series for me that Kuyper did, and this speaks to his. I think it's a kind of genius that he can make you, even as, say, a professional academic theologian who's got all kinds of, postgraduate degrees and studied this for a long time. He has a way of making something that if somebody had asked you, hey, here's proposition X or Y, do you affirm it? Oh, yeah, sure, that's true. But he has a way of making it true to you in a way that you hadn't thought of before, right? So, and it relates directly to what you were just saying. So some of the first instances of common grace that Kuyper talks about, yes, the Noahic covenant is absolutely central for him, but it's the curse and the promise after the fall where actually common grace comes to its first historical expression. So if you think about the way this is in many Bibles, right, that chapter of Genesis or section of that chapter is headed the curse. Mm-hmm. But if you read through it, and it's there's a lot of bad stuff that's being promised that's going to happen. There's blessings in each one of those. So when God talks to Eve and says, all this bad stuff is going to happen, you're going to have children, is the promise. It's got a caveat that it's going to be in the context of great suffering and pain, but you're going to have children. In the context of the curse of Adam, you're going to toil. It's going to be troublesome and laborious, and you're going to suffer, but you will have bread. And Kuyper makes, I think, it's just amazing how he talks about those realities, because we so often are just focused on how horrible things are, and that's part of fallen human nature, I guess, is to complain about our lot. You took us away from Egypt, and I'm super hungry and thirsty now.
Yeah.
You took us out of the Garden of Eden, and I don't. All this other stuff's going to happen. And yet, in the face of such radical rebellion and these consequences, he promises Adam and Eve and all of their posterity, you're going to have children and you're going to have food. I'm going to continue to preserve you. And so, when we're reading these genealogies, it's like, okay, here's some strange named person and whatever. It's almost like trivia, or you skip those parts or it's boring. But every one of those represents covenant faithfulness by God to say, I said you're going to have children, and here's another generation. Here's another generation. Here's another generation. Here are all these generations that I've continued to preserve and allow to come forth in the context of your, radical rebellion against me. What a powerful expression of divine grace.
Absolutely. Now, this has been great because we've brought it back to the biblical narrative that a lot of people from a lot of different faith traditions share. Now, what's the contribution of common grace to Christian social thought as a whole? What would a Roman Catholic, an Eastern Orthodox, someone who's just broadly evangelical, what contribution is there? What familiarities might they recognize in another form?
Yeah, so I think Kuyper was correct that it's an Orthodox with a small o part of the Reformed tradition to talk about common grace in this sense. I'm not saying everything he says about common grace is, correct or a proper articulation of it or whatever, but he's right that this doctrine itself is part and parcel of the Reformed tradition, and it had not really been focused on until his day. It fills a lacuna in the sense that Roman Catholics had been struggling and continue to struggle and dealing and wrestling with the problem of nature and grace for a long time. And this is essentially a Reformed doctrine of the relationship between created nature and saving grace. That's what common grace is for Kuyper. And so in that sense, it's a model to other traditions that also maybe haven't done it as well, or, I'm not telling people what they need to do, but, I think a Lutheran could look at this and say, maybe there's a place for some analogous doctrine in the development of our systematic theology and our moral theology that needs to be taken up. And certainly, again, Roman Catholics have done it where they were doing it before Kuyper. They continue to do it after. And in some sense, there's been fruitful dialogue between the two to help clarify the points of division and agreement. So in that sense, I think it stands as a model, and it's kind of the necessary work to do in order to produce a principled and authentic and genuine school or tradition of social thought from a particular religious tradition, or at least Christian tradition. So, I mean, it's really hard, I think, to have an authentic and historically but also doctrinally rooted and grounded Reformed social ethics without an articulation of common grace. Or it's going to reject the doctrine of common grace and look quite different in terms of its conclusions. Yeah. So that gets back to the part of the controversy, right? Is how helpful is this doctrine? How necessary is it? And from my perspective, it stands as a kind of a model. And first of all, if you're convinced that the Bible teaches it, then you have to include it in your systematic somehow. But not just as a kind of one paragraph thing. It's actually, I think Kuyper was prescient in the sense that he understood that as more and more diversity and pluriformity is coming to expression, or at least we're confronted with it in the world now, and it's just it's a fact that of reality nowadays, where it wasn't, if you lived in a hamlet, in central Germany or something like that. It's much more of a salient and necessary doctrine to have the proper hold of than it maybe was in a much more narrower world, or a world that didn't have as much exposure to all these kinds of diversity and so on. So, I think Kuyper was prescient, and I do think it has something to teach us today yet, which is partly why, major reason that we've brought it into translation. It's also helpful for correcting things. So, common grace has been a controversial thing ever since Kuyper propounded it. It's led to church splits. It's led to theological, disputes. It's led to, at least certain forms of it have led to unwholesome and unrighteous accommodation of cultures. So, there's a version of common grace that doesn't do justice to the ongoing reality of sin, that becomes a kind of transformationalist excess that thinks that we can just go out and usher in the kingdom ourselves, and all this sort of stuff. So, in that sense, getting back to Kuyper himself helps us understand the historical, what he actually said, what he meant it to mean, and then what later versions of it, if they've departed or corrected or further elucidated the doctrine helpfully or unhelpfully, how all that fits in. And so you can't have an excuse to have a caricature of Kuyper and common grace anymore, where if all you had heard was Kuyper and transforming the world to God's kingdom or something like that, you could be led down some pretty dangerous paths.
Now, this was over a decade ago when a lot of these projects were beginning, and I was talking to you about this, and I started asking you all these questions, the sort of questions that I'm asking you now. And you've done very well to answer them. And I thank you so much for that. But you told me again and again, you got to read Kuyper. Read Kuyper. And in our discussion about how you feel that he serves as a model of Christian social thought, I think that's true, because it's only in reading him that you can see not only his answers, but the way he formulates questions that are very pertinent to our time, and then his method to go about exploring those. So there's value in Kuyper, even if you disagree with his conclusions. He's a very rigorous thinker, a very careful thinker, and somebody who really fought to bring every thought captive to the scriptures and to the broader theological tradition. Jordan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Dan.
As always, thank you so much for listening today. Our team loves putting this show together for you every week, and it's so encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important to us because it lets us know what you like to hear more of, including the kinds of topics you're interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can reach our team at actonline@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Eric Cohn.